The marble statues stand silent in museums across the world, their perfect forms frozen in eternal beauty. These classical figures, with their idealized bodies and serene expressions, have shaped our understanding of ancient Greek civilization for centuries. We admire their artistry, study their philosophy, and celebrate their contributions to democracy and rational thought. But behind these polished facades lies a darker truth that scholars have long whispered about in academic corridors but rarely discussed in public forums. Ancient Greece was not the sanitized civilization of our textbooks. Beneath the veneer of philosophical discourse and artistic achievement existed a society where sexuality intertwined with religious practice in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. The Greeks did not separate the sacred from the carnal, as later Christian societies would. Instead, they wove sexual acts into the very fabric of their spiritual beliefs, creating rituals so intense and disturbing that even contemporary Romans found them excessive. Today, we venture beyond the comfortable myths of classical antiquity to explore the terrifying sexual rituals that defined ancient Greek religious practice. These were not mere cultural curiosities, but fundamental expressions of divine worship that shaped the lives of millions across the Mediterranean world. From the sacred prostitution of temple complexes to blood-soaked fertility ceremonies, the Greeks created a religious landscape where pleasure and pain, ecstasy and terror, divine communion and human degradation existed in constant tension. The archaeological evidence tells a story that classical education has long suppressed. Temple inscriptions detail payments to sacred prostitutes. Archaeological sites reveal ritual chambers designed for sexual ceremonies. Ancient pottery depicts religious scenes of startling explicitness. Literary sources, when read without the sanitizing lens of Victorian scholarship, describe practices that blur the line between worship and violation. These were not isolated incidents, but systematic religious traditions practiced across centuries and throughout the Greek world. Understanding these rituals requires abandoning our modern assumptions about both sexuality and spirituality. For the ancient Greeks, the body was not separate from the soul, and sexual energy was not distinct from divine power. Their gods engaged in sexual acts of extraordinary violence and passion. Zeus transformed into animals to rape mortal women. Dionysus drove his followers to sexual frenzies that ended in death and dismemberment. These were not metaphorical stories but literal truths that demanded ritualistic reenactment by human worshippers. The evidence emerges from multiple sources, each adding layers to our understanding of practices that academic scholarship has long avoided examining in detail. Archaeological excavations at sanctuary sites reveal architectural features designed specifically for sexual rituals. Underground chambers connected to temple complexes provided spaces where initiates underwent transformative experiences that combined spiritual revelation with physical violation. The positioning of altars, the design of sacred pools, and the layout of processional routes all point to carefully orchestrated ceremonies where sexual acts served religious purposes. Literary sources provide even more disturbing details when examined without the protective filter of euphemistic translation. Ancient Greek writers described religious festivals where normal social boundaries dissolved entirely. Citizens who maintained strict moral codes in daily life participated in rituals that would have horrified them in secular contexts. Women who lived in virtual seclusion emerged during certain festivals to engage in sexual acts with strangers as expressions of divine service. Men who prized honor above life submitted to degradations that served mysterious religious purposes. The psychological impact of these rituals extended far beyond their immediate participants. Entire communities structured their calendars around festivals that culminated in sexual ceremonies. Children grew up understanding that religious devotion might require sexual sacrifice. Families prepared their daughters for temple service that included prostitution. Young men trained for initiations that tested their physical and psychological limits through sexual ordeals. These practices shaped Greek society at its most fundamental level, creating a civilization where spiritual authority and sexual power remained inextricably linked. The goddess Demeter presided over some of the most disturbing rituals in the Greek religious calendar. Her cult centered on the Eleusinian mysteries, secret ceremonies that promised initiates direct communion with divine power. Modern scholars have pieced together fragmentary evidence suggesting these mysteries included sexual elements of extraordinary intensity. Initiates underwent psychological preparation designed to break down their normal mental defenses. They consumed psychoactive substances that heightened their susceptibility to both spiritual revelation and physical violation. In darkened underground chambers, they participated in rituals that reenacted mythological scenes of divine rape and transformation. The festival of Dionysus revealed another dimension of Greek sexual spirituality. Known as the Dionysia, these celebrations officially honored the god of wine and ecstasy through theatrical performances and communal drinking, but ancient sources describe parallel ceremonies conducted away from public view where devotees sought union with their deity through increasingly extreme sexual practices. Women known as Maenads abandoned their homes to join nocturnal processions that culminated in frenzied sexual encounters. These were not voluntary expressions of female liberation, but religiously mandated abandonments of normal social roles that often resulted in psychological trauma and social disgrace. The cult of Aphrodite created perhaps the most systematic integration of sexuality and spirituality in the ancient world. Her temples functioned as religious brothels where sexual acts served as forms of prayer and devotion. The famous temple at Corinth employed over 1,000 sacred prostitutes whose services generated enormous wealth for the city while supposedly ensuring divine favor. Visitors from across the Mediterranean came not merely for sexual pleasure, but for spiritual experiences that combined physical gratification with religious revelation. These encounters followed prescribed ritual patterns designed to channel sexual energy toward divine communion. Archaeological evidence from Aphrodite's temples reveals the calculated nature of these sexual rituals. Excavations have uncovered specialized furniture designed for specific sexual positions that held religious significance. Ritual implements suggest ceremonies that combined sexual activity with blood sacrifice and other forms of physical ordeal. Wall paintings and mosaics depict sexual acts performed in explicitly religious contexts, often showing participants wearing ceremonial masks or adopting poses that mirror mythological scenes of divine sexual violence. The training required for temple prostitutes indicates the sophisticated theological framework underlying these practices. Young women selected for sacred service underwent years of preparation that included instruction in sexual techniques, religious doctrine, and psychological manipulation. They learned to induce specific emotional and spiritual states in their clients through carefully orchestrated sexual encounters. These were not simple commercial transactions, but complex religious ceremonies requiring extensive knowledge and skill to perform effectively. Male participation in these rituals took different but equally disturbing forms. Young men serving as temple attendants often underwent sexual initiations that tested their psychological resilience and religious devotion. These ceremonies frequently involved older male priests who claimed divine authority for their actions. The psychological impact on participants was considered evidence of successful spiritual transformation rather than abuse. Survivors described profound alterations in their understanding of reality and their relationship to divine power. The festival of Artemis presented perhaps the most paradoxical sexual ritual in Greek religion. Though the goddess demanded virginity from her followers, her major festivals included ceremonies where this very virginity was violently destroyed in her honor. Young women serving in her temples underwent ritual defloration performed by priests claiming to act as divine intermediaries. These ceremonies were attended by the girls' families, who viewed their daughters' sexual sacrifice as expressions of religious devotion rather than violation. The psychological preparation for these rituals began in early childhood, creating a generation of women who understood sexual trauma as spiritual privilege. The social implications of these practices extended throughout Greek society, creating complex networks of religious obligation and sexual exploitation. Wealthy families competed to provide daughters for temple service, viewing such placement as both honor and political advantage. The sexual exploitation of these young women was reframed as divine service, making resistance tantamount to blasphemy. Communities that failed to provide adequate participants for sexual rituals faced threats of divine punishment, creating social pressure that ensured continuous participation in these disturbing practices. The economic foundation supporting these sexual rituals created a vast network of exploitation that permeated every level of Greek society. Temple complexes functioned as religious corporations, generating enormous wealth through the systematic commodification of human sexuality disguised as divine service. The priests who administered these institutions accumulated power that extended far beyond spiritual authority, controlling trade routes, political appointments, and social hierarchies through their management of sacred prostitution networks. Financial records carved into temple walls reveal the staggering profits generated by these operations, with individual sexual encounters priced at according to elaborate schedules that reflected both the perceived spiritual value of different acts and the social status of participants. The recruitment process for these sexual rituals reveals the calculated manipulation employed by religious authorities to maintain their supply of victims. Families living in poverty were approached by temple representatives who offered financial relief in exchange for dedicating their children to divine service. These arrangements were presented as religious honors rather than commercial transactions, creating psychological frameworks that made resistance extremely difficult. Parents who questioned these practices faced social ostracism and threats of divine retribution, effectively coercing their participation in systems that would destroy their children's lives. The physical preparation of ritual participants involved procedures designed to maximize both their sexual utility and their psychological vulnerability. Young women destined for temple service underwent dietary modifications intended to enhance their physical attractiveness while simultaneously weakening their capacity for independent thought. Herbal preparations administered under the guise of spiritual purification included substances that increase libido while reducing inhibition and critical thinking. These chemical manipulations were combined with isolation techniques that severed participants' connections to their previous lives and identities. The architectural design of temple complexes reflected sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and crowd control. Underground chambers were constructed with acoustic properties that amplified sounds of pain and pleasure, creating atmospheric effects that heightened the emotional impact of sexual rituals. Ventilation systems channeled incense and other aromatic substances designed to induce altered states of consciousness. Lighting arrangements used flickering flames and reflective surfaces to create disorienting visual effects that enhanced participants' susceptibility to religious indoctrination and sexual exploitation. The training regimens imposed on temple prostitutes involved psychological conditioning techniques that would be recognized today as systematic brainwashing. Novices underwent periods of sensory deprivation alternated with overwhelming stimulation, breaking down their normal mental defenses. They were taught to interpret their own suffering as evidence of divine favor and to view their sexual exploitation as acts of sacred service. This conditioning was reinforced through daily rituals that combined physical pain with sexual activity, creating psychological associations that made resistance increasingly difficult. The role of drugs in these sexual rituals extended beyond simple intoxication to include sophisticated pharmacological manipulation designed to enhance both spiritual receptivity and sexual compliance. Temple priests maintained extensive knowledge of psychoactive substances derived from plants, fungi, and animal sources. These preparations were administered to participants before sexual encounters to induce states of consciousness that blurred the boundaries between pleasure and pain, reality and hallucination, consent and violation. The resulting experiences were interpreted as divine communications rather than drug-induced episodes, providing religious justification for continued exploitation. The seasonal calendar of sexual rituals created cycles of anticipation and trauma that shaped the psychological landscape of entire communities. Major festivals required months of preparation during which participants underwent increasingly intensive conditioning. The approach of these events generated collective anxiety that affected everyone from the direct participants to their families and the broader community. This systematic creation of psychological tension served religious authorities by maintaining populations in states of heightened emotional vulnerability that facilitated manipulation and control. The aftermath of sexual rituals involved elaborate ceremonies designed to reintegrate participants into normal social roles while preventing them from processing their traumatic experiences in psychologically healthy ways. Purification rites were presented as cleansing participants of spiritual contamination rather than helping them recover from sexual assault. These ceremonies reinforced the interpretation of trauma as religious privilege, making it extremely difficult for victims to understand their experiences as abuse or to seek appropriate support and healing. The international dimension of these sexual rituals created networks of exploitation that extended across the Mediterranean world. Greek colonies established temple complexes that replicated the sexual practices of their homeland, spreading these disturbing traditions throughout the ancient world. Diplomatic relationships between city-states often included exchanges of temple prostitutes, with these human gifts serving as both religious offerings and political tools. The normalization of sexual exploitation within religious contexts influenced other cultures that came into contact with Greek civilization, spreading practices that would persist for centuries. The documentation of these sexual rituals in ancient literature reveals the extent to which such practices were considered normal and even admirable aspects of religious life. Poets celebrated the beauty and devotion of temple prostitutes without acknowledging their exploitation. Historians recorded the economic benefits of sacred prostitution without questioning its human costs. Philosophers developed theological justifications for sexual violence disguised as spiritual practice. This literary treatment created cultural narratives that obscured the reality of systematic abuse while perpetuating its continuation. The resistance movements that occasionally emerged against these sexual rituals faced overwhelming institutional opposition from religious, political, and social authorities whose power depended on maintaining existing systems of exploitation. Individuals who spoke against temple prostitution were accused of blasphemy and faced severe legal penalties. Families who attempted to protect their children from ritual sexual abuse found themselves excluded from community life and economic opportunities. These systematic responses to resistance ensured that opposition remained isolated and ineffective, allowing the continuation of practices that caused immeasurable human suffering. The psychological legacy of these sexual rituals extended far beyond their immediate participants to influence Greek concepts of sexuality, spirituality, and social relationships for generations. Children who grew up in communities where sexual exploitation was normalized as religious practice developed distorted understandings of consent, intimacy, and personal autonomy. These psychological patterns were transmitted through families and social institutions, creating cultural frameworks that perpetuated cycles of abuse and exploitation, even as specific ritual practices evolved or disappeared. The medical knowledge developed by temple priests to maintain their supply of sexually exploitable victims included understanding of anatomy, psychology, and pharmacology that was remarkably advanced for its time. These practitioners could identify physical and emotional vulnerabilities that made individuals particularly suitable for different types of sexual exploitation. They developed techniques for managing pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, and psychological breakdown among their victims. This medical expertise was closely guarded and passed down through secretive priestly lineages that maintained monopolies on both religious authority and specialized knowledge of human manipulation. The marble facades that grace our museums and textbooks will never look the same once we understand the horrific realities they concealed. Ancient Greece was not the enlightened civilization of popular imagination, but a society built upon systematic sexual exploitation disguised as divine worship. These practices shaped Mediterranean culture for centuries, creating networks of abuse that extended far beyond temple walls. The archaeological evidence, literary sources, and architectural remains tell an unambiguous story of human suffering transformed into religious spectacle. As we admire classical art and philosophy, we must remember the countless victims whose pain and degradation funded the very achievements we celebrate today.